say something about the Mesolithic to this audience. So I realised looking back at the abstract I wrote rapidly for Neve that saying Mesolithic Ireland asking the right questions might seem a little bit presumptuous or a little bit arrogant. So I've softened it slightly here to suggest that perhaps it's a case of asking better questions than the right questions. But what I want to do in the next about 40 minutes or so is just give you a sense of some slightly new ideas and ways of thinking about the Irish Mesolithic. Now, many of these are drawn from the work which was published in January this year in my new book, Hunter-Gatherer Ireland, Making Connections in an Island World. And I'd like to take just a moment now to thank many colleagues across the Irish archaeological profession, many of whom are here today, for their assistance in this book in answering questions about data or reports or radiocarbon dates or providing images overall. So it really was a wonderful opportunity to reach out to people and try and reflect the wide range of work that's been done on the Mesolithic in Ireland. You'll be glad to know I'm not trying to summarize the entire book in the next 40 minutes or so. This is a kind of parallel discussion of a couple of aspects of it, I suppose, and I dip into a couple of case studies. With good comedy timing, about half hour ago, I got my first royalty statement for sales from the book, and I'm delighted to report that so far I've made the princely sum of £4.91 from sales of the book. Okay, so one of the things that I was trying to do with the book was tell a story of the Mesolithic, tell a story of the deep time hunter-gatherer past of the island that prioritised people, that prioritised the choices that people made, the connections that they established with the other aspects of their world, and which really paid critical attention to how we construct knowledge of the Mesolithic past overall. And one of the ideas that was really important to me in doing this was a feeling that the Mesolithic of Ireland needed a story. It needed a narrative, it needed a framework, it needed a history, if you like, in some ways, a story that people could hang on to. And this really connects me to one of the first points I want to make, which is that for a long time, I think Ireland has probably lacked overall frameworks of what was happening in the Mesolithic. Now, I want to unpick this a little bit, and I want to look at a couple of examples of this. But I think in general, there's not been very many interpretive frameworks for making sense of all of this material, which means that when people on an infrastructural development, they carry out fantastic archaeological work and they try and write up their Mesolithic site, what they're often left talking about is people hunting, fishing, and gathering, because there's not much else in terms of the story for them to be able to kind of lock onto and develop through the materials that they've excavated. And it's worth just looking at this, I think, in a little bit more detail. So if you think about the works of synthesis that seek to bring the Mesolithic out to broader audiences, I think it's hard to argue that Ireland hasn't been, these are unusual in an Irish context compared to other parts of the world. So probably the two book length, the two monograph length treatments of the Irish Mesolithic are Peter Woodman's 1978 BAR, his PhD, and his 2015 book, Ireland's First Settlers. Now there's 37 years between those two book length publications. In contrast, if we were to look in Scotland, book-length treatments of the Scottish Mesolithic were published by different authors in 95, 98, 2004, and 2005. So there's a difference here in making the stories of the Mesolithic accessible to people who aren't specialists in that period. And I think that's really important when it comes to trying to highlight the significance of this material and of why it's exciting overall. Against that background of perhaps an absence of synthesis, an absence of pulling this together and showing why it's important, there's a few, I think, dominant themes in approaches to the Mesolithic in Ireland. One is, I think, in general, that the Mesolithic is considered to not be very exciting in an Irish context, slightly underwhelming in terms of the archaeological materials and with little story to tell. There's then a couple of other themes which have come through quite strongly, and I want to look at these in more detail today. The first is that in recent years, the single largest phase of excavation that's taken place in Ireland since state formation, the wave of work carried out post-Celtic Tiger years, the very strong statements that some scholars have made that this has made little contribution to Mesolithic studies overall. And the second is a very, very long-standing tendency, and we could look at all kinds of post-colonial contexts here in different ways, but one that sees the Mesolithic of Ireland as being isolated, different, and simplistic compared to its neighbouring islands. And this is the second case study I want to look at today. So we start by looking at this idea about the commercial sector and the contribution it's made. So a couple of quotes here from recent papers by Peter Woodman and by John Waddell, overall, both of which are really very clear in stating that although there's been large amounts of infrastructural work carried on, this has, well, according to Waddell, it has not appreciably advanced our knowledge of the period, and Peter says it's not as great as might have been expected. They both highlight that there are some outstanding and remarkable archaeological sites, particularly things like the waterlogged fish traps at Clowenstown or from Northall Quay, or the cremation burials from Hermitage. But in general, beyond that, they're saying there is not much of a contribution because many of these excavations are simply finding occasional spreads or pits or a stake hole, nothing that appears to be of much significance. And so they make these, what to me seem to be slightly dismissive statements. Now, I can get quite cross about these statements, and I can get quite frustrated by them in a number of ways. One is that these seem to lack a certain courtesy to people who've worked really, really hard excavating sites in difficult conditions, recording that material very well and bringing it into the public domain. And this kind of dismissal of that contribution, I think, is unfortunate. The other is that this seems to me to suggest a real misunderstanding of the archaeological record of the Mesolithic period. Rather than bemoaning the fact that there's not much more spectacular stuff, we could instead take seriously the repeated quality of material which is being excavated on infrastructural developments, the spreads, the occasional pits, the occasional post holes, the few stone tools, because this is the archaeological record of the Mesolithic period in Ireland. In a review of radiocarbon dated Mesolithic sites, which will be published shortly, and I'll mention later on, Robert Chappell, Roe McLaughlin, and myself, we've shown that 58% of all radiocarbon dated Mesolithic sites in Ireland were excavated in advance of development. So this is a very, very substantial contribution to our understanding of the period. So the question then becomes, how do we try and make sense of this fairly quiet, this fairly ephemeral archaeology, which isn't spectacular? I'm not trying to argue this is spectacular at all, but this is the nature of the record. This is what we have to make sense of. One way we can do this is by thinking about things like hunter-gatherer architecture overall. And here it's interesting to note, obviously, hunter-gatherer architectural features have been excavated on a number of Mesolithic sites, but in the absence of an overarching framework to make sense of these, we get sidetracked in some quite frustrating discussions. There's one about particular sites where the excavators had interpreted these as windbreaks, whereas someone synthesizing them interpreted them as huts. Neither set of parties had actually identified what defined a hut or what defined a windbreak. And if you look ethnographically, windbreaks are used as huts all of the time anyway. So this is a discussion that wasn't really going to go anywhere. So how can we think about this material? What are the better questions, if you like? Okay, so if you want to think about mobile architecture, and that's a deliberate choice of term, understanding architecture which is often designed with ideas around mobility in mind. The dominant image in terms of Mesolithic architecture in Ireland is undoubtedly Mount Sandal, Peter's excavations from 1973 to 1977 above the River Bann, a large, approximately 6-meter subcircular structure defined by posts and stakes, repeatedly rebuilt on the same location, approximately 7,700 BC, give or take. Very much part of a tradition of building that's found across the north of Britain at this time, and an example on the right-hand side here of one of the reconstructions we built of this at the UCD Centre for Experimental Archaeology. Substantial buildings. But Mount Sandal still stands as not quite alone. There's a couple of other sites that have some similarities, but very unusual in the Irish context. We don't have an archaeological record full of Mount Sandal type houses. So what do we have, and how can we think about this? Well, in order to think about the Irish material here, I turn to the Norwegian Mesolithic literature, and in particular a PhD thesis by Celia Fretheim, which sought to synthesize the much more substantial record for Mesolithic architecture in Norway. And she divided these up into 3 types overall. She talked about houses, she talked about composite buildings and tents. Now, houses, according to Celia, were things like Mount Sandwell. These are large, permanent structures that could have been occupied for considerable periods of time. Composite buildings are really interesting. I'm not going to have time to talk about this in detail here, but composite buildings are buildings where some feature of the architecture is left on site and is repeatedly reused. So one example that she uses in a Norwegian context is the poles for constructing tent. The poles are left on site and people return on an annual basis and put new coverings on those. And I think there's one possible nice example of this in an Irish context at Eglinton, where these numbers of small structures here, quite distinctive, small subcircular structures, many of which have a distinctive porch as well. These are defined by stake holes, with most of the stakes themselves identified as being about 8 or 10 centimeters in diameter. Now, if you're living in a wooded environment and you're trying to move around, my assumption is that you're not going to be carrying wooden stakes that are 8 to 10 centimeters in diameter. These are going to be long, these are going to be cumbersome, these are going to be difficult things to move around with. So perhaps these are left stored on site, the stakes are left stored on site, and people return to these and reconstruct the coverings, be that skins, be that bark, be that vegetation of different kind. And it may be that composite building, that attraction back to that space, that means we have these repeated forms at Eglinton itself. But more importantly, I want to think a little bit about tents in this context. And Celia argues that tents, she says, these are portable buildings. They're built to be easily assembled, disassembled, and transported. As a consequence of this, tents, almost by their design, leave very, very little coherent archaeological signature. In exceptional circumstances, we might find some evidence of this. And I might, in terms of questions and discussion, I can talk about one of our Scottish sites as a parallel here. In exceptional circumstances, you can. But most of the time, this would leave perhaps a stake hole or two, perhaps a scoop where activity took place, perhaps a fireplace. Exactly the kinds of evidence that characterizes the majority of Mesolithic sites in Ireland. In some places, we have deposits which, at Belderrig, for example, the image on the bottom left here, my excavations at Belderrig, also Ferreters Cove, also possibly Fenor. We have the accumulation of 10 or 15 centimetre deep occupation soils rich in archaeological materials, but very jumbled, without any real ability to pick out clear horizons within them. These are the sorts of things you might imagine: repeated activity over time, repeated construction, disassembly of tents and other light structures forming these very, very mixed deposits. And it's just interesting to note, in a Norwegian context, theirs are a little bit deeper than our ones. In a Norwegian context, these would be called culture slag slokka. Okay, I'm not going to try and pronounce the rest of that one, but these are culture layers, which are interpreted in terms of very intensive activity in particular locations, whereas the Irish stuff tends to be seen as much more ephemeral and light. So I'm trying to persuade you that much of the evidence we have from the Irish Mesolithic is coherent with the use of tents by hunting and gathering communities. That explains the character of many of the sites we're looking at. And that then begs a question. Why are these hunter-gatherers constructing tents? Now, on the one hand, we might see this as a straightforward question. The stereotype says they're hunter-gatherers, they're mobile, therefore they must be constructing tents. But we know they're capable of constructing other types of buildings. So why are they choosing to construct these light tents? What is it that makes tents an appropriate solution to the challenges, the problems that they face? What is it that makes tents right for Mesolithic communities in Ireland? And here it's worth just moving on to look at the comparative anthropology of hunter-gatherers. And in particular, a key feature of these of mobile hunter-gatherers is that they often live in very, very, what seem to us to be quite small groups. A number of 25 is often cited, but there's much more variety than that. But within those groups of 25 people, there is a real intensity to the character of social interactions, an intensity to the relationships between people. So David, for example, throughout the day, every day, the fewness of these people impresses itself upon the observer. The constant exposure of each other, not just to one or a few others, but to almost all of the others, all of the time, throughout a lifetime. The architecture of these settlements brings people close together. The way people sit and interact. Jerome Lewis, the anthropologist, talks about this as sharing of bodies, limbs spread across limbs in different ways. And a wonderful piece of work by Barry Hewlett and colleagues has shown that this proximity, and here's a group of people sharing sleeping arrangements, this intimate living overall actually has hormonal knock-on effects which serve to encourage trust. There's a positive cycle that runs around all of this, that sharing bodily contact makes you feel better, which makes you more likely to share bodily contact, which makes you feel better. And Hewlett and others argue that the separation characteristic of Western ways of life is actively eroding the physiological basis for trust in communities. If we think about a key feature of hunter-gatherer sociality, a key feature of this is sharing of food, is sharing of possessions, but is also sharing of presence overall. And a couple of really important summaries here, David Troisin and Noah Lavy's work. David and Noah argue that a key feature on hunter-gatherer sites is these very light, very simple structures that encourage the sharing of space overall. House design and site structures manifesting a social preference to ensure maximum sharing, co-presence, and living together. And Thomas Whitlock, in his really important book about the anthropology and economy of sharing, he sees the significance of sharing as resulting from the recognition of the ways that these communities live extended selves. Their selves are linked to all of the people around them, the joined lives that they link. And he suggests very simply that sharing has to be placed on the side that is opposite the house, that sharing is sustained by these types of socialities, these types of architectures that bring people back together. So rather than saying that the hunter-gatherer use of tents in Mesolithic Ireland is simply a product of people's mobility, I want to argue, and I have argued in the book, that this results from a deliberate choice in terms of sociality. A way of living which promotes sharing, which promotes a recognition of the links that bind these communities overall, and that those architectural choices, which were played out over a long period of time in Ireland, are an attempt to maintain this particular way of life and this particular way of being. The second case study I want to look at focuses on these ideas that have been strong in the literature for a long time but come back recently, about the Irish Mesolithic as being isolated or technologically simplistic. And this is a really interesting case study because actually if you track back recent arguments, you realize that lying behind them are a whole series of implicit and explicit analogies that come from colonial era Tasmania. And actually what we've done in a really unexpected way, and I did not expect to find this out as I was working on the book, this really surprised me. What we've done is actually recreate colonial era Tasmania in the Irish Mesolithic overall. And it's quite a strange thing. So for a long time, the distinctive later Mesolithic stone tool technology of Ireland was discussed in terms of being crude or simple. This is something that goes back to Movius and the writing of the early 20th century. Peter Woodman, in normalizing the Mesolithic, stepped away to a large extent from this language, although it's still in there in a little bit. But these arguments about the simplicity of this technology received a significant boost in the late 2000s with work by Felix Rieder. Felix took a very early modelling of radiocarbon dates from Ireland, a very, very small sample, which we would now recognise is not really representative, and used these to argue for a population collapse at about 8,200 years before present, a time of a significant climate change. And as you can see from his language here, Felix is very much emphasizing these images of loss and isolation and simplicity overall. Felix's model was, he's very explicit about this, prompted by a general population model by someone called Heinrich, published in 2004. And Heinrich used a parallel to contact era Tasmania, and the arguments that Tasmania had seen a very significant technological simplification, including the loss of fishing technologies and the loss of some bone tool technologies caused by the isolation of Tasmania from Australia across the Bass Straits. And it's important here to go back to this colonial era contact of Tasmania and where lots of these narratives about Tasmanian simplicity and Tasmanian backwardness came from. Tasmania, during the time of British colonisation, there was a very significantly scientific racist series of discourses developed about Tasmania, which produced what was known afterwards as a myth of extinction. The idea that these communities were destined to die out anyway because of their simplicity, because of their isolation, and therefore the ravages of British colonialism and genocide and eco-colonialism in that area, they were just hastening the end, if you like. And as Annemieke Milks argued some time back, in all of these accounts, underestimations of population size, misrepresentations of their technologies, they went hand in hand with the removal of indigenous populations from land coveted by these settlers. Now, when Heinrich published his paper, there was an immediate and very strong response to this, and there's a couple of debate pieces that follow. And the key debate piece focused on two aspects. One was criticism of the mathematical population models that Heinrich used, and the second was his take on the Tasmanian data for this isolation and simplicity. I can't speak to the population models at all. I don't have competency in that area. But the rebuttal of Heinrich's interpretation of Tasmania was really very, very compelling. And it's very notable that in Heinrich's response to this, he tries to defend his mathematical model, but he doesn't make any defense at all of the Tasmanian data itself. He can't defend that at all. Clearly, he is wrong in the use of that. And if we look now how most people understand the last couple of thousand years in Tasmania in the post-contact period and what contact colonial agents were describing, the emphasis on Australian archaeology now is very much a narrative of, let's just say, replacement and transformation. That over this period that Heinrich was commenting on, we're looking at a society that becomes expansive, dynamic, and innovative. So far from a closing down and a closing off overall, it's a period of significant change and dynamism. And again, if we look at the Irish material, we can see this as well. Rather than talking about isolation and simplicity, the later Mesolithic in Ireland sees new things start to appear, like these perforated cowrie beads from Fanor, or these wonderful groundstone moina points that appear in the later Mesolithic. We have this dynamism. We have this change. We don't need to pin this to a narrative that really comes out of a colonial context that sees islands as isolated and simplistic overall. One of the other themes that runs through this has become, so readers' arguments about simplicity have actually become quite influential at international level. They get quoted quite a lot in big data approaches that seek to marry radiocarbon dates to supposed population levels, and also in some of the genetic discussions as well. And Lara Cassidy and Dan Bradley's recent work on two probably Mesolithic individuals from Ireland highlight some of this as well. So they talk about the lack of genetic evidence for inbreeding in the Mesolithic population and highlight that this is quite remarkable because the island population is supposed to be only 3,000 or 10,000 people. Now, this is another one of these moments where you can track things, and it's quite fun overall to actually see where this comes from. Now, Lara says that Peter Woodman, quote, said it was 3,000 to 10,000 people. I might have missed this, but in Woodman 2015, I can only see him say 3,000 to 5,000 people. Woodman's quotation is actually based on an Australian archaeologist, Rhys Jones's work. And Rhys Jones was an Australian working in Tasmania overall. And Rhys Jones, there's actually significant debate about whether he really was a scientific racist or not. He caused immense anger amongst the Aboriginal communities in Tasmania for promoting stories about the death of their culture and about the last Tasmanian. For a long period of time, he was unable to return to Tasmania because of the anger he'd caused in the communities. He was known to the Tasmanians, in his own words, as FWC, and I'm not going to offer a translation of the first or third one of those, but the W in that is white, so you can guess what the other ones might be. Rhys Jones's estimates of contact era Tasmania, which is smaller than Ireland anywhere, are based on the accounts of George Augustus Robinson, and this is George Augustus Robinson here. Augustus Robinson was the mid-19th century British agent whose job it was to forcibly remove Tasmanian Aboriginals from the main island of Tasmania onto resettlement islands off the coast itself. And again, his observations have been demonstrated to be problematic in terms of the way they record size overall. And most modern accounts by historians looking at the looking at the population size of Tasmania at this contact period are double those sorts of estimates itself. They suggest 6,000 to 10,000. And if you play those numbers through in an Irish context, you get somewhere between 7,000 and 12,000. Now, I should stress, I think all of these games of numbers, all of these population figures they're fantasy maths. I don't think any of them are particularly real overall. But my interest here is how in another way, these stories of Tasmania, these British colonial discussions and descriptions of a Tasmanian context have actually come back round and infiltrated themselves into our understandings of the Mesolithic of Ireland. So these stories that the Mesolithic of Ireland is low population, is isolated, and is technologically simplistic are actually coming through this use of the Tasmanian data. And I think it's also probably unarguable that lots of these play to much more long-standing imperial ideas about imperial stereotypes about Ireland relative to Britain overall. But there's also, in this Tasmanian island island discussion, there's also just one more thing which is really, really interesting, and something which is missed from a lot of these discussions of the Tasmanian population. At the time of contact, Tasmania was described was divided into 100 clans, 9 nations, and 5 language groups. Those nations, some of those nations had friendly relationships with each other. Others were at long-term war. I don't know, I don't believe we have data on the kind of interbreeding that might happen across nations themselves or across language groups in this context, although again, with many hunter-gatherers, we know that hunter-gatherers are often very multilingual and can move across these groups. But this suggests a significant potential complexity to population structures in Ireland itself, which simply has never really been considered overall. To go back to the quote from Lara at the top there, it's interesting to ask, why are we assuming that it is the island which is the appropriate size to consider meaningful populations at in terms of genetic inbreeding? Because there are certainly other possibilities here in terms of understanding population size and population structure overall, and all of which I think helps give us a better sense of some of the reality and the texture of social lives. The last point I want to make is still thinking about these issues about isolation and change. So I hope to have shown you that many of these can actually be traced back to some quite problematic analogies overall. That actually we already have evidence quite clearly of significant dynamism, significant creativity at this time. But we can also just shift and move our scale of analysis a little bit. So about a month before my book was published, Chantal Cannella published her wonderful book, The Mesolithic in Britain, Landscape and Society in Times of Change, the most substantial synthesis of the British Mesolithic for many, many years, based on a rigorous reanalysis of all of the radiocarbon dates for Britain and a detailed typological analysis as well. Not just typological, that's in there, but it's a massive synthesis of all of the material. And as a consequence, Chantal redefines the chronology for the British Mesolithic into, rather than just an early and later Mesolithic, into an early, middle, late, and final Mesolithic overall. One of the things that's really interesting here is how this maps with the Irish material. So the early Mesolithic in Britain is considered to be mainly pioneering and colonizing settlement, followed by a diversification and regionalization that begins in the middle Mesolithic, characterized by large pit houses and some elaborate funeral treatment of the dead, very much what we see in the early or earlier Mesolithic in Ireland. That regionalization continues and becomes more marked through the late Mesolithic, and there's then evidence for continental connections in the final Mesolithic. We could, in this sense, think about the supposed idiosyncrasies of the Irish later Mesolithic, those changes in stone tools, simply as being a more extreme manifestation of a tendency to regionalization that was happening throughout the Irish and British Isles in this period of time, rather than being something which is completely insular, completely distinctive, completely unusual. It's just a stronger manifestation of a historical trend which was linking all of these sorts of areas. And Chantal and I are currently working on a paper where we're going to suggest aligning the terminology for the British and Irish Mesolithic to help us gain that better contextual understanding of what's happening on the islands through this time period. On the left here is a summary graph from work by Bob Chappell, Ron McLaughlin and myself, which should be published in the next couple of weeks as an open access paper. This is a summary of all of the radiocarbon dated archaeological sites from the Mesolithic in Ireland. We haven't done the same kind of typological work that Chantal did with the British. That still needs to be done. Our sequences of technological change in the Irish Mesolithic are still, Peter Woodman did great work on refining the understanding of the earlier and later Mesolithic into what he now sees as 4 different facies, 4 different aspects of those industries. But that still, the dating of that is still reliant at key points on a fairly small number of sites, and it's mainly from the northeast of Ireland. So further typological work is needed. But we were able to pull all of the material together and try and tell some histories of the Irish Mesolithic, and we could identify that the change from earlier to later Mesolithic seems to correlate with a significant overall shift in the visibility of archaeological sites. Probably not because of population levels, but possibly because of these new ways of moving and using the landscape associated with the new stone tool technologies. Moving from radiocarbon dates to population estimates is always a challenging issue, and as we say, most of the Irish Mesolithic, we don't think we can say anything significant about population. But it's interesting to note that at the very end of the period, perhaps the last millennium or so, we do see increasing numbers of radiocarbon dates that it's harder to explain away by any other factor other than possible population growth overall. And we argue in the paper that tendency to population growth, which in many hunter-gatherer contexts is associated with the development of inequality, with the development of social complexity, we argue that it's possible that the long-standing Irish Mesolithic commitment to sharing, to egalitarian relationships, to sharing presence, to living together, we argue that might be a strategy of trying to resist the accumulation of power and prestige in particular individuals. But that's a longer and more complicated argument I can't quite summarize in the remaining 2 minutes that are here, but the paper will be open access very shortly. By way of close, I just want to highlight a couple of forthcoming things that might be of interest in terms of the Mesolithic and hunter-gatherer archaeology. The first is CHAGS 13, the Conference on Hunting and Gathering Societies. This is the biggest conference of hunter-gatherer specialists in the world. We pre-COVID we'd hoped for about 450 people. Post-COVID we're probably hoping for about 300 to 350 people. But this is a significant event to bring together anthropologists, archaeologists, hunting and gathering communities to consider the future of hunter-gatherer research. Places are still available at CHAG should anyone wish. The website is there, and many thanks to lots of the organisations below who've helped us with this. We've taken a very strong stance that this is an opportunity to foreground Irish hunter-gatherer research, Irish Mesolithic research to an international community. So in association with this, we're publishing a special issue of the Proceedings of the Royal Irish Academy, which will be a retrospective of key publications on the Mesolithic from 1912 through to 2022, 14 papers in there with a new introduction. Working with TII, we're publishing a story map, an interactive story map of key archaeological sites. Heritage Council have kindly supported a production of one of their really nice glossy 24-page guides that will be going out to all delegates and available more widely. And our wonderful MSc hunter-gatherer archaeology students have produced a series of Mesolithic postcards to highlight awareness of the period. And that provides a very nice link to say that if any of this makes sense to you, if any of this sounds like something which is interesting, our MSc in hunter-gatherer archaeology, which started this year, is still recruiting. We're still ready to take on new people. So if you're interested, please get in touch. But for now, that's everything that I wanted to say. Thank you very much indeed.
Thanks, Graeme. That was absolutely fantastic. Really, really good. I'm going to open up the last 20 minutes then for questions, if you're happy with that, Graeme. So if anyone has any questions, I'm aware the majority of you are muted right now, but you can unmute yourself by clicking the icon just next to your name, and you are able to ask questions in the chat. So if anyone has anything they'd like to ask, please do so. Well, Graeme, I might start with a question then, if that's okay. So in terms, I had never seen the connection between the Tasmanian, I suppose, issues of colonialism and coming through in the Irish record. But as you were talking, I realised that once you highlighted it, it's actually it's very easy to see it comes through so much of the research in terms of the language, in terms of how we talk about material and people and colonies at that time. I suppose, how do we start untangling that? How do we start moving away from those perceptions of colonialism in our own research? Are they inextricably linked that we can't remove them and continue to talk about Mesolithic in a way that's understood?
It's really tricky. I use the term hunter-gatherer throughout this presentation. That's a deeply dodgy term, really, really problematic in lots and lots of ways. Comes out of the same context, is implicit in genocide and eco-colonialism in exactly the same ways. Working with a colleague, Ben Elliott, who some of you will know. We last year ran a workshop on decolonizing the Mesolithic, and we're just submitted a paper to Norwegian Archaeological Review for a big debate piece on what decolonizing the Mesolithic might actually mean. What taking seriously the fact that very large amounts of the foundation of our knowledge are based on perspectives developed through the colonial era, and what that means if you take that seriously. And one of the issues there is that the roadmap, the way forward, becomes slightly less clear. It's almost unsettling in some ways. But I think one thing that is really important is tracing those intellectual genealogies. So those examples of Tasmania, for example, yeah, that's all just in the literature. I didn't have to do anything particularly special to do that. I just followed up references, and then went to go and read loads of stuff about Tasmania. And then it shows just how problematic all of these sorts of things are. So removing the legacy of colonial thought from archaeology is a very, very challenging task, and it leaves us with quite different futures. Very creative and interesting possibilities for futures.
Absolutely. I have a question here from Connor McDermott. If you're unpicking older notions, what were tents made of?
Tents could have been made of lots of different things. You can have a bark covering, you can have a vegetation covering, you could have skins of something like seals, for example. You could have skins of fish potentially being used. But there's a range of different materials which could have been available for people. Obviously, we have very little direct evidence of anything in terms of the specifics of that, but lots of possibilities that are there.
Just in terms of the CHAGS conference in June, are there many sessions happening? Have you got many participants right now? Is there a list of where we can get a program of events?
Yeah, so the website that I gave you there, ucd.ie/CHAGS13, that has everything there. We currently have 34 different thematic sessions. 250 delegates signed up so far. The opening address is by two representatives of the Hadza community, and is about the Hadza today and tomorrow, the challenges that community face now and how they want to be living in the future. The second keynote address is about the way in which stereotypes of hunter-gatherers are consumed in the public imagination in Britain and Ireland, and how that commodification of hunter-gatherer lifestyles is very damaging for contemporary hunter-gatherers. We've then got, excuse me, there's sessions on everything from experimental archaeology through World Heritage and hunter-gatherers, through the sessions focusing on David Wengrow and David Graeber's new book, The Dawn of Everything, sessions on watercraft, hunter-gatherer atmosphere, just about anything you can imagine in terms of hunter-gatherers. It should be really exciting.
Super. And then just the last question, just to ask you, you mentioned your wealth of royalties coming through from your new book. Can you tell us where we can purchase this lovely piece?
I believe you will be able to purchase that at almost any bookshop in Ireland. If they don't have it in stock, they'll be able to order it for you. Then I'd certainly recommend you do that rather than order it from a large international retailer named after an area of rainforest.
Super, super. I have a few more questions coming through from other people. So any thoughts on the impact of hunter-gatherer habitation distribution at the end of the Mesolithic and choice to Neolithic settlement / architecture choice and connection with landscape, such as reverence for mountains in Cuil Eora. Apologies for my pronunciation there.
Yeah, it's a really good question, and one of the things I kind of sidestepped in the book was really discussing the Mesolithic Neolithic transition in detail, and in the same way the radiocarbon modeling that we did, we set aside the kind of interface period between the Mesolithic and the Neolithic, because to really understand that properly, I think you actually need to go back to that material itself. All of those sites dated about 4,300 and following, and actually really rigorously assess what's in those sites and what's going on. But a paper that Miriam McCutcheon, Jessica Smith, and myself published a couple of years back tried to review the period before the house horizon arrives. And certainly there's more of a sense of potentially different things going on. Perhaps a Neolithic that's more associated with the use of animals rather than cereals, and certainly some continuity of what seems like hunter-gatherer activity on some sites. So there's quite late dates from Fanor, for example, quite late dates from Belderrick, as well, on what look like classically hunter-gatherer sites overall. But I don't think we're quite there at the moment in thinking about the exact locations within landscapes and how that works. But it's a really important need, a really important thing to be addressed.
Thank you, Graeme. And then I have a question from Kathy. Kathy Moore, are we going to find more sites, and where will they be?
That's a lovely question. I wish I knew the answer. Yeah, we're going to find more sites. We're going to find more sites because people are finding these sites on all forms of infrastructural development. Mesolithic stuff turns up. We can see that from the radiocarbon data that we have at the moment. Now, the vast majority of those sites, they've only been identified by one radiocarbon date. They are these spreads and different things like that. But they're there. They'll continue to accumulate, and we can either ignore them and say they're not important, or we can take them seriously and try and use them to actually understand the period as a whole. We will also hopefully get more wonderful waterlogged and wet things and remarkable sites like that as you know, as more work is done in bog environments. But they can be in lots of different places, and the probably the most important ones will be the ones that aren't where we expect them to be at all. That challenge the understandings we have of how Mesolithic sites in Ireland are behaving overall. But yeah, they'll undoubtedly be more, and we have to make the most of them when they turn up.
And then just kind of a linked question from Ross: is there any particular approach you would like to see added to assessment testing in advance of large infrastructure projects?
Yeah, that's another really good question. First comment I'd make is the quality of work which is done on a lot of those projects seems to have been really, really high. There's great Mesolithic archaeology been recovered, and our ability, again, the radiocarbon project was really interesting for this. This happened during lockdown. I sat here in the same little corner of my bedroom I'm sat in now, and of the 119 sites which are radiocarbon dated to the Mesolithic, the vast majority of that I could very, very easily get hold of all of the information online through things like the digital repository and stuff like that. I think it was about 5 or 6 sites I had to reach out to friends and contacts and ask for further detail. But that's a remarkable ability just to access stuff, you know, remotely, all of that material being available to everyone. So that's really important. I think in terms of the people's work in assessing and testing these things, a sensitivity to the potential significance of these spreads and these little fairly uninspired looking sites quite a lot of the time. I think that's key, because that's the evidence that always is turning up. Appropriate sampling of those, in many instances that's taking, but that's obviously really important. Some of the best sampled sites in that give us a detail and an ability to tell stories in ways that others aren't. But taking seriously that really quiet information, and you know, having the awareness of what the lithics might mean in terms of chronology to help refine those decisions on site. But lots of people are doing a really cracking job. I wouldn't have been able to tell the stories I did. I wouldn't have been able to write the book I did if there hadn't been so much good work done by them.
Fantastic. And then, Graeme, just one more question from Michael Watch. Graeme, do you have a view on the possibility of the existence of a land bridge to Ireland that predates the Irish Mesolithic?
So this again, it's a kind of long-standing discussion. Most of the recent paleoenvironmental reconstructions, so this is Robin Edwards at Trinity and his colleagues, most of those put the last timing of a land bridge linking Britain and Ireland back into the late glacial at about 16,000 years ago. So that's before any human activity took place in Britain or Ireland. So the colonization of Ireland by humans took place by boat. You also then get a whole series of questions. I didn't have time today, so I took out the section of this paper on the way in which Mesolithic people structured the environment of Ireland, not least through bringing animals with them. It's probable they brought boar with them. They certainly brought dog with them. They possibly brought wildcat or lynx with them. And if you really want to have fun, it's vaguely possible that they brought bear with them as well, all of which would have had a significant impact on the ecology of Ireland. And whenever people talk about Mesolithic people in Ireland inhabiting a natural woodland, they certainly did not. They inhabited a woodland which was fundamentally altered and transformed by the human activities that took place within it. And then we can talk about rewilding, but that's a different debate entirely.
Super, that's great. Well, we might just end it there. I think everyone's offering their thanks, Graeme. And my sincere thanks again for taking the time this afternoon, for giving this wonderful talk. Really interesting and always great to hear about the Irish Mesolithic and the new things that are happening.
Thanks to you all. Come to Chags.